If people already won their freedom and they were kicking and crying and screaming because they didn't want to lose it, why would those people write in their history of the New Testaments of calling themselves the most embarrassing name for their people, Gentiles, when they obviously had won their freedom from the Maccabean revolt? I mean, it doesn't make sense anymore. Oh, I won my freedom, but about 150, maybe 200 years later, I'm still going to continue to call my people Gentiles. No. It doesn't make sense. And here's some accounts that you can read. I'll put them on the screen here, and you can read them for yourself. There's a woman who basically, mothers were killed for circumcising their children. There was an old man who was who had practiced Judaism his whole life, and he was put to death. There was a very famous story about a mother and her 7 sons who were each brutally killed by Antiochus, the king, and how she had, basically was persuaded by the king to get them to embrace the customs of the Gentiles, and that he would sit her sons at his right side and call them friends of the king. And they said no. Every last one of them died for their faith. This is a mentality of the people that, were forced to call themselves Gentiles. Some people were, there's another account where people were put in caves and they were practicing the Sabbath. And the writer who wrote the Maccabees said that the people who were found in those caves by the soldiers did not fight because it was a Sabbath. Remember, you couldn't work on the Sabbath? He said they didn't even lift a fist. They just basically died, at the hands of their oppressors. So these are some of the mentalities and accounts of the people who didn't even want to be called Gentiles. And you mean to tell me that in the New Testament that all of a sudden they're willing to just give that up? No, it doesn't even make any sense at all now. Now, as I continue to, go throughout this, there's one thing I did want to say, and that is, this also goes into what I was trying to tell all the black Hebrew Israelites in the beginning, and that is that you are a Jew by a physical act and a verbal vow to God's covenant. That means if you're a male, you circumcise yourself, and from there, you make a vow. I can see it right now, just probably before the laws and the prophets and before all the people of Israel. You make a vow to live your life under God's covenant, and from there, that's what makes you a Jew or an Israelite. Women, they didn't have to circumcise themselves. All they had to do was make a vow to the covenant. And also, this also goes to, I'm really not trying to get off subject here. I'm going to get back to this in a second. But if you notice in the book of Exodus, how the Pharaoh constantly complained about why are these people multiplying so fast. They weren't multiplying because they were, having all these babies and things. It's because, someone can become a Jew overnight. Now, of course, after they go through the physical act and the verbal vow and things like that, I'm pretty sure there's other things they have to learn, but, eventually those people become Jews. What made you an Israelite was a physical act and a verbal vow. So I'm going to continue to read some more interesting endings here as to what happened at the end of the revolt. So how about we read, well, I'll brief this one. If you read in 2 Maccabees chapter 10 verses 1 through 8, it'll basically talk about the rededication to the temple. So you go ahead and, look online or get a book, get the Maccabees book and read it for yourself, and you can read about how they tore down all the Baal altars and all that, and they put up a new altar for God, and they rededicated to the temple. You know why? Because they won the revolt. Another thing that happened in terms of, them winning their independence and they didn't have to worry about being called being called Gentiles anymore, is that they converted the Edomites. The Edomites are the Idumeans. Josephus testifies to this. Everybody knows that once you decide to become circumcised, and take a verbal vow to the covenant, it makes you a Jew. That's why Josephus, being a Jew himself, had testified to this. He said, look, the Idumeans who didn't want to, do God's people right were all killed, and there was a few of them that were left. And those few that were left had a choice: either become a part of the Jewish family or die. And they decided to become absorbed, or converted to becoming Jewish. So they became Jews. The last remnant of Edom was possessed by Israel. This, I believe, comes from Amos 9:12. That's a prophecy that's fulfilled. Amos was written about 400 or 500 years before that incident happened. So there it is, a fulfilled prophecy. Let's also continue to read what happened during this whole affair. So, in conclusion, my burning point I've been trying to make since the beginning is that the people who call themselves Black Hebrew Israelites, saying that Jesus only died for the Jewish race and was only sent for the Jewish race, these people, look at me, look at me. These people are lying to you. For what means, I do not know. But I've just proved to you, biblically, with the same account that Nathaniel 70 used, Maccabees, that the Jews won their freedom and they were no longer forced to call themselves Gentiles. So, what does that mean for the New Testament? What does that mean when people are talking about proselytes and all these other things that people don't want to look up any definitions for? I will tell you that entire story in the New Testament. When we get to the New Testament, I'll break it all down. For right now, I'll give you guys some homework. You can read the chapter 5 of the book of Acts. There was this big problem with people coming into Judaism and Christianity. The Jews hated those people who came into Christianity because they were not circumcised. As a matter of fact, also, before we get into some of the information here, I will lastly leave you with one more thing. In the beginning of the video, you kind of noticed that he picked up a Zondervan book, a Zondervan book dictionary, something like that, and he was reading all these crazy definitions, mainly one, and it said usually it means a non-Israelite people. I can tell you right now, I'll put it up on the screen here, that the word Gentile in the Old Testament comes from the Hebrew word goyim. Goyim is literally translated as nation. That's it. Period. That's what the Hebrew writers written down. Now, for the rest of this stuff, basically I'm going to put some definitions on the screen here. Since he likes to use the Zondervan dictionary, I'm going to be using let's see, Easton's Bible Dictionary. I'll also be using Fawcett's Bible Dictionary, and also Brown Dryburn Briggs. I can never say that. They have a dictionary as well, and there's other dictionaries I'll be using. So let's just get started and showing you those 4 definitions of Gentile. I'm not even going to read what's on the screen here, but what I will say is that in the Old Testament, the word Gentile only has one meaning, but in the New Testament, it has many meanings. Mainly, it mainly means to be a Greek. This is the only reason why the Zondervan Bible and just about any other dictionary or Bible dictionary will tell you the word usually. That's the only reason why the word usually is in there. Because in the Old Testament, goyim meant goyim. It just meant nations. But you can imagine after the Nebuchadnezzar captivation or captivity, and after the Maccabean revolt and all these other people, the word Gentile also meant that you were a Greek. Other than, just not being an Israelite, those other nations. So that's the only reason why it has that meaning. So what are you going to believe? The the actual scriptures here that reference this and show this as an example? Or are you going to take Nathaniel 7's word for it? Somehow it just means the Jews who were once called Gentiles but are really Jews. No. So what's going to be? Are you going to believe him? Or are you going to believe these scriptures here that show plenty of examples? And the scriptures here that show the actual translations themselves of these very words that I'm showing you. So this is a great definition that basically summarizes a lot of the material that I will be covering in September. I definitely hope this helps. So let's read it. This definition comes from the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. The Gentiles are far less sharply differentiated in the Israelites from the Israelites in the Old Testament than in the New Testament times. Under Old Testament regulations, they were simply non-Israelites, not from the stock of Abraham. But they were not hated or despised for that reason, and they were to be treated almost on a plane of equality, except certain tribes in Canaan with regard to whom there were special regulations of non-intercourse. It's funny because everything we're about to get into is just about everything that I summarized in my covenant series. How the strangers, yet there was a law for them, yet there was a law for the Jews too. It's only going to reiterate everything I've been trying to tell you guys. It says, the Gentile stranger enjoyed the hospitality of the Israelite who was commanded to love him. In Deuteronomy chapter 10 verse 19. You can read about that yourself. To sympathize with them. For ye know the heart of the stranger, seeing ye were strangers in the land of Egypt. Wow, strangers. Once again, we said that strangers was the synonym for the word Gentile. I guess apart from God, that's how the Israelites felt. They felt like they were Gentiles or strangers. In Exodus 23 verse 9, you can read about that. The Kenites were related almost as brethren, especially the children of Rechab. See? Judges chapter 1 verse 16, and Judges chapter 5 verse 24, and Jeremiah chapter 35. Uriah the Hittite was a trusted warrior of David. Yes, a Hittite. 2 Samuel chapter 11. Ittai the Gittite was captain of David's guard. 2 Samuel chapter 18 verse 2. Names I cannot pronounce. The Jebusite was a respected resident of Jerusalem. Wow. Just like Cornelius. So we can already see that, the Israelites talk about men who may not be Israelites, but, they still regard them as devout people. The Gentiles had the right of asylum in the cities of refuge, same as the Israelites in Numbers chapter 35 verse 15. You can read about it there. They might even possess Israelite slaves, which is Leviticus chapter 25 verse 47. And a Gentile servant must not be defrauded of his own wage, in Deuteronomy chapter 24 verse 15. They could inherit in Israel even as late as the exile, in some of these verses here, Ezekiel chapter 47 verse 22 and 23. They were allowed to offer sacrifices in the temple at Jerusalem, as is distinctly affirmed by Josephus, and it is implied in the Levitical law, Leviticus chapter 22 verse 25. Prayers and sacrifices were to be offered for Gentile rulers in these verses here, and gifts might be received from them in these verses here. And of course they received gifts in Maccabees because they won the war. We approach the Christian era, the attitude of the Jews toward the Gentiles changes.